name is Ann Nye, and I'm introducing Michael Hiltzik. He's the LA Times business columnist and blogger. He will speak to us today about the post-Trump era and the new Biden-Harris administration and his latest remunerations. His LA Times writings covered such varied topics. The latest column in today's LA Times was on economic inequality and the scores of American billionaires who helped bankroll the Trump Victory Fund and who benefited from Trumpian handouts to corporations and the affluent. Michael Hiltzik shared the 1999 Pulitzer Prize with colleague Chuck Phillips for articles exposing corruption in the entertainment industry. His latest book, published in May 2020, is Iron Empires, Rubber Barons, Railroads, and the Making of Modern America. Please welcome Michael Hiltzik.
Thank you, Anne. I hope you can all hear me and see me okay. Just a moment of advertising for myself. Here's the book, which it came out in mid-year. And I'm already working on my next book, which will come out in about 4 years from now, so God willing. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for joining me. I think the last time I addressed this group, it was in person in PV several years ago, so it's great to be back with you, even if we're having to do it remotely. And of course, here I was afraid when I first agreed to do this that we'd have nothing to talk about. And of course, things haven't quite worked out that way. So I guess there are some pluses and minuses to conducting these sessions online. No one has to worry about traffic or the weather, so more of you can attend. On the other hand, you do have to worry about your computer and Wi-Fi and all those technical things. So I hope everything is working for you. And maybe a year from now, we can have yet another one of these meetings, this time in person. Anyway, I've got a few comments to make to launch our meeting today, after which I think we'll have plenty of time for questions about anything you'd like to talk about. I'm going to talk generally about the last 4 years that we've lived through and look ahead to the Biden administration on a couple of major topics. And then we'll throw the floor open and pretty much anything you want to ask me about current affairs or the upcoming 2 or 4 years, I'm wide open to talking about. So I'm going to start by thinking back to November 8th, 2016, a date which, as Franklin Roosevelt might have said, that will live in infamy. It's a day that's particularly memorable for me because it fell on the day before my birthday, which by law happens to be the first date in November other than November 1st, which cannot be an election day. So that's a mixed curse because sometimes I spend my birthday in misery, and that was certainly the case in 2016. Contemplating the election results that day and judging from what I knew about Donald Trump, who I'd met several times in the 1980s while covering business in New York for the Los Angeles Times, I figured that the best we might hope for was a sort of political stasis. What I knew of Trump was that he was lazy and sort of a moron. So I figured, left to his own devices, he wouldn't actually do much. We wouldn't see any advances in healthcare reform, but what we had as a result of the Affordable Care Act was good enough for a while and would get us through 4 years or so. We wouldn't get much help for the most vulnerable members of society, like low-income workers and immigrants. But we hadn't gotten all that much from previous administrations, Republicans or Democrats. So 4 more years of nothing happening, I thought we could probably live through that. The only real question was what would happen if the country had to face a genuine crisis like a military attack or natural disaster. But I figured that military attacks weren't very likely and aren't very common. And even if one happened, there was, after all, professional leadership at the Pentagon. And as for natural disasters, they happen fairly regularly, but the Obama administration had bequeathed us professional disaster management in place, right? So my fingers were crossed, and I think a lot of other Americans felt the same way. Whether we're Republicans or Democrats or progressives or conservatives, through the decades, we've seen presidents take office who are not of our thinking, who don't have policies that we agree with, and we always seem to survive in the end. So none of us was really prepared for how bad the ensuing 4 years would be. None of us was really prepared for the sheer cruelty of the Trump administration, compounded by its incompetence and its absolute resistance to governing, the resistance just from the top, the very top, to very deep into middle management of the executive branch. We weren't really prepared for the vandalism that Trump and his minions were going to impose on the federal government. And we weren't really prepared for the supine reaction of Republicans in Congress, including, obviously, Republican leadership in the Senate. So I think one of the real disappointments of the last 4 years has been the complicity of the Republican Party in Congress and in state houses coast to coast. Well, we're all aware today of the harvest. I think inescapably, the proper way to think about the Trump administration is that it has been a White House that celebrates, that really revels in cruelty and death. In the earliest months of this pandemic, which marks its 365th day since being discovered in the US right about now, there were ample public warnings that if the government did not get its act together, we might see 200,000 COVID deaths by the end of 2020. And that seemed horrific beyond imagining. Well, today we're at 400,000. Back on June 16th, some of you might remember, Vice President Mike Pence published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal ridiculing the idea that the country was then experiencing a second wave of COVID infections. His piece was headlined, "There is no second wave." Why, he wrote, the daily average number of new COVID cases at that point had fallen to 20,000, down from 30,000 in April and 25,000 in May. So not to worry. And of course, this piece was an excuse for the inaction that we saw from Pence, who after all was the supposedly the head of the White House task force on the pandemic. Inaction from Pence and from everybody else in the executive branch. Well, today, the daily average of new cases isn't 20,000 and it's not 30,000 and it's not 40,000. It's 246,000 new cases in the US every day. Now, there's near universal fury at this dereliction of duty at the White House. The news gets worse every day. Last week, you may all be aware, the White House announced that it was freeing up the supply of vaccine doses it had held back to make sure that people who got the first dose would be sure of getting the second dose. This is of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which really work best with 2 doses. So state officials coast to coast expressed relief and gratitude that their supplies were going to be augmented. And then it turned out that there was no supply, that every dose the government had ordered had already been shipped, and the cupboard was bare. So the deaths will continue, but it's not just about the pandemic. On Friday, the Trump administration, abetted by the Trump augmented majority on the Supreme Court, executed its 13th prisoner since July, according to the federal death penalty. Now, I can't put this in context any better than Justice Sandra Sotomayor did in dissenting on Friday from the court's decision to allow this execution to go ahead. And here's what she wrote. After 17 years without a single federal execution, the government has executed 12 people since July. Today, Dustin Higgs will become the 13th. To put that in historical context, and I'm still quoting Justice Sotomayor, the federal government will have executed more than 3 times as many people in the last 6 months than it had in the previous 6 decades. This is not justice. And of course, you may know that President-elect Biden has pledged to end the federal death penalty and to work for the end of the death penalty at the state level across the country. So we're going to have something on the order of 72 hours more of this in which anything can happen. But I want to move past that and talk a bit about the differences we'll be seeing starting Wednesday at noon, and we've already started to see. I should mention, by the way, that until a couple of weeks ago, almost everything I wrote about Biden's policies was provisional because it seemed that he would have to work with a Republican Senate. So farewell to that. It was a great turnabout and one that some of us hoped for, but I certainly hoped for it, but I didn't think that was the way to bet until the results finally came in. So let's start with healthcare, which of course is on everybody's front burner. As I wrote in the last week of October, when it seemed safe to say that Joe Biden would win the election, the Biden administration will have numerous tools at its disposal to end 4 years of vandalism and attacks on the Affordable Care Act by Trump, and to countermand many of Trump's most egregious acts of sabotage. Some changes can happen quite quickly. Trump employed executive orders and administrative tools to undermine the ACA and Medicaid, in virtually every case aiming to strip working class and low-income Americans of their access to coverage. Well, what's sauce for the goose works just as well for the gander. Biden can use the same tools in reverse. The most evident threat to the ACA overall, and that's the lawsuit by Texas and other red states aimed at declaring the entire 2010 law unconstitutional, is still alive. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on this case just after Election Day, and it's unlikely to issue a ruling until next spring at the earliest. But the newly Democratic Congress can render the case moot with a slight alteration of the law's language. I think we should expect that to happen very soon after Biden takes office, especially now that he's got a Democratic Congress to fulfill his request. Biden has shown that he's determined to put scientists front and center in healthcare. This will be a major change from the Trump administration, which denigrated scientists, which reassigned scientists, which drove them out of their jobs, and replaced them with ideologues. So hopefully, we can already see from the appointments that Biden has made that he will eradicate this anti-science approach of the Trump administration, which ignored, of course, scientific advice in fighting the pandemic, really took advice that there was no reason to fight the pandemic, that it would just go away. Trump's healthcare team has also relied on not misinterpreted or even non-existent data to justify some of its most destructive programmatic initiatives, such as the imposition of work requirements on Medicaid enrollees, which I've reported over and over again, doesn't help Medicaid enrollees to get jobs and doesn't help them to get well, because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between work and healthcare and work and employment and health on the part of the Trumps. So we can expect attacks on Medicaid, which were central to Trump's healthcare approach, to cease immediately. Forget about any further work requirements or doing things like block granting Medicaid funds to states, which block granting, as I've also reported, is just another form of benefit cutting and ties the hands of states just at the point that they need more flexibility, not less. We may also see extensions to the open enrollment period for those signing up for ACA plans via the government's healthcare.gov website. Open enrollment lasted originally from November 1st, 2015 through January 31st, 2016 for 2016 plans, and the same dates a year later for 2017 plans. The Trump administration rolled the deadline back to December 15th for 2018 plans. And that cut enrollment because, as everybody knows, all experts know, health plans typically see a surge in signups in the final few weeks of open enrollment. And by cutting that off, Trump made sure that that surge would be moderated. Biden can also, on his own, reinstate outreach and marketing funding for the ACA, which was cut by 90% under Trump, despite evidence that the spending had helped thousands of Americans navigate their way through the complicated process of signing up for Obamacare plans. Biden, who's a foursquare supporter of the ACA, should also reimpose limits on short-term health plans. Under Obama, these short-term plans, which lack the consumer protections established by the ACA, were limited to 3 months and were non-renewable. And that's because they were designed as bridges between more serviceable coverage, whether we're talking about Medicare, employer plans, or full-scale ACA plans. Trump permitted them to become, to have a term of 1 year and to be renewable, which of course undercut the insurance pool for the ACA. The short-term plans were often cheaper than full-scale plans because they can reject or surcharge applicants with pre-existing conditions. They can cap annual or lifetime benefits, and they lack other consumer safeguards. Health insurance experts have always feared that these cheaper plans will siphon younger and healthier consumers away from the ACA, driving up premiums in the ACA market. And I don't think there's any question that Trump and his advisors wanted exactly that to happen. Biden could also begin a transition to universal health care by lowering the eligibility age for Medicare, say to 55 or even 50. Now, as I've written, I don't think Medicare is necessarily the best model for universal health care, for reasons we can go into during the question period if you'd like to hear more, but it can be a start, particularly for older Americans in their 50s. The change I mentioned would require congressional action, but now that's certainly within reach. Biden can eliminate Trump's limits on reproductive health programs and coverage, including gag rules that prohibit healthcare providers that receive federal funding, such as Planned Parenthood, from providing abortion services or abortion counseling. He can scrap a Trump rule allowing more employers to refuse to offer contraceptive coverage to workers, which is required under the ACA, by claiming that they have religious or moral objections to contraception. He has Biden has already proposed altering the subsidy structure of the ACA to make it available to more families and to eliminate the so-called subsidy cliff in the original law, which provided subsidies to families earning up to 400% of the federal poverty line and denied them to families earning 400% plus $1. Now, let's turn to the other major threat to our health, indeed, to our very existence on this planet, and that's climate change. For the last 4 years, we've had to worry about the next rule that's going to come from the White House to help polluters and undermine public health. We should be excited to not have to think about that anymore. California was on the front lines of the fight against Trump's attempts to roll back environmental laws and regulations. The state participated in more than 60 lawsuits, often with coalitions of other blue states, to block those changes, most importantly, to protect its own authority to set its own auto emissions standards. Well, now we have a president with a genuine climate plan. It was described to me in November as the strongest plan we've ever seen from a presidential candidate, never mind a president-elect. That description came from Gina McCarthy, who was then CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council, or the NRDC. Well, 1 month ago, Biden appointed Gina McCarthy as the head of his climate agenda team at the White House, so we know he's serious about turning this country back into the right direction on climate change. Biden has signaled a shift in federal climate change and environmental policy that will reestablish science as the guiding force in the government's approach after 4 years in which science was disdained by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Interior, Energy, and Transportation departments. He has said that on the first day of his administration, the U.S. will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. President Trump's withdrawal, which made the U.S. the only nation on the face of the planet to reject the accord setting goals for reduction of greenhouse gases, took formal effect on November 4th, the day after the election. Importantly, Biden has framed the battle against climate change in terms of economic and social justice. Government spending can fund millions of jobs, rebuilding the nation's infrastructure to accommodate an energy grid to support renewable power generation, according to Biden's transition website, but we have already seen more concrete indications of what he's going to be doing. His plan includes expanding charging stations for electric vehicles and building new transmission lines from wind and solar farms to population centers. His goal is a pollution-free power sector by 2035, while, as he put it, righting wrongs in communities that bear the brunt of pollution. He's also said that he views the fight against climate change as an all-of-government imperative, so it's involving not only agencies with an environmental portfolio, but also the whole spectrum of domestic and foreign policy government bodies. Rejoining the Paris Accord can be accomplished by executive action, and if you saw a report from Washington in the LA Times just this morning, it's already clear that that's going to happen almost immediately upon Biden's taking office. Biden also can resume enforcing environmental laws already on the books after 4 years of hands-off regulation. Trump began or completed the process. Trump began or completed the process of rolling back 125 environmental rules and regulations. He hollowed out protections against pollution, eliminated constraints on logging and oil drilling in sensitive areas, reduced efficiency standards for appliances and vehicles. The Trump administration lost 82 of 100 legal decisions related to rulemaking on energy, the environment, and natural resources. Often these adverse rulings were the result of a lack of a suitable administrative record to support the new rules, the result of laziness or incompetence at the agency level. It wasn't unusual for federal judges to conclude, as did federal Judge George H. Wu of Los Angeles in a case involving the Trump Act, but environmentally dubious Cadiz water project in the Mojave Desert, that the administration, and I'm quoting Judge Wu here, seemingly cherry picks portions of different sources to craft a case for a desired result. Such a slipshod approach might have been the undoing of one of Trump's most aggressive attacks on climate change policy, and that's his effort to roll back Obama-era auto emission standards and mileage standards while revoking California's long-held authority to establish its own vehicular regulations. We won't need the courts to speak now because Biden can consign that effort to the trash bin. The California waiver exempting it from federal rules placed this state in the forefront of national initiatives aimed at reducing greenhouse gases. And as we've reported, 13 other states accepted California standards at their own, accounting for nearly 40% of the US auto market. And that made California the setting of a de facto national standard. Nevertheless, the Trump administration pulled ahead with its attempt to roll back the standards. But the Trump plan was half-baked from the start. Its supposed scientific foundations debunked by 11 experts at leading universities, including UC, San Diego, Davis, and Berkeley, USC, Yale, and MIT. The weakness of the administration rationale spurred lawsuits from 22 states and the District of Columbia. General Motors, Fiat, and Toyota, along with several other foreign car makers, chose to throw in their lot with Trump, taking the administration's side in this litigation. This now looks like a very bad call, since with Biden's ascent to the White House, it's likely that the government will reestablish those Obama standards and the California waiver, rendering the legal battle moot and putting them on the wrong side. The holdout companies are already beginning to show some awareness that they hitched their wagons to the wrong star. They've reached out to California to see if they can't now come into agreement with California standards. Now, even where Biden has the authority to take unilateral action on climate change, practicalities are going to stand in his way. Experienced professional staff have fled or been driven out of the EPA and the Departments of Energy and Interior, with many, if not most of them, lost to federal service forever. Rebuilding will not be quick or easy. The Trump agenda was basically a blitzkrieg against those agencies, and it's going to take time to rebuild. So, talking generally and summing up, we've seen a restoration of the fundamental concept of appointing professionals and adults to the cabinet and other important posts in the executive branch. We can hope to see a return to the level of integrity of the Obama administration, which lost not a single official to criminal accusation. For Trump, the number is more than 100. We can also look ahead to economic growth based not on the sugar high of a tax cut for the wealthy or a deregulatory policy that privatizes the benefits of deregulation and socializes its costs so that deregulation looks falsely like an economic boon. We can look ahead to an administration intent on bringing maximum economic assistance to ordinary Americans, not just to the wealthy, as is already evident from Biden's $1.9 trillion pandemic relief proposal. Anyway, there's a lot more that we can talk about in terms of federal policy and conditions here in California and what we expect and hope to see in the next 2 or 4 years. And I don't want to narrow the discussion by holding the floor any longer. So I think now we can open Zoom to any questions you might have.
There we go. I was trying to unmute. Okay. Thank you very much. So there are a lot of questions, some that a bunch that came in early. So I'm going to go through those first. And as we continue, folks can put their questions in chat, and myself and Carol Muller will accommodate those. So one of the first questions that has been on people's mind, and something that I thought we could talk about, has to do with whether, do you feel there's enough time to continue with the Senate trial, plus, in terms of impeachment, plus perform essential Senate business after January 20th. So that's been on a lot of people's mind. Do you continue with the trial?
Well, I'm not an expert in Senate procedure or congressional procedure, but I think certainly what we're hearing from Nancy Pelosi and from the appointees she's made as impeachment leaders is that there certainly is a way, especially now that we've got a Democratic majority Senate, to work that out so that if necessary, the Senate can bifurcate its floor activities. It can devote part of a day to the question of convicting the president on the impeachment charge, and part of the day to everything else it needs. Look, this Senate under the Republicans rushed a Supreme Court appointment into action with barely a week before the election. They can obviously move fast and get a lot done when they want to, and I would expect that to happen. I think, candidly, from my own standpoint, the sooner this gets done, the better. There's no reason why it needs to be done before Trump is out of office. But I think letting it sit around and age is probably not the best approach.
Okay. I was told Tony has his hand up. Usually what we're going to do is just say the question. Tony, do you have to say your question, or is it something that you can put in chat? Okay. I'm gonna move on to the next question. This has to do with something you had talked about a little bit. This is from Mike Grimshaw. He has a question about the COVID-19 vaccine distribution confusion, bureaucracy, or political. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff lately in terms of who's profiting, and we gave money. Pfizer accepted money and is now has the highest price for their vaccine. So and I know you've written about this.
Yeah, I've written a couple of times about what the role of the federal government should be in ensuring an adequate supply. And from what I've seen, obviously there are a lot of questions about how to distribute the vaccine, who should really be managing it, who should get it, what sort of priorities. But there does seem to be a general concern, and the reason that we have all of this confusion about distribution is because we don't actually yet have an adequate supply so that everybody who wants the vaccine can get it. And that what I've written about that is that the blunder, I think, that we saddled the system with was leaving manufacturing to these companies, to Pfizer and Moderna in the case of their vaccines, when in fact the federal government has the legal right to, it's called march in, and take over and license itself for the vaccines and make its own contracts for manufacture. Obviously, Pfizer and Moderna are going to make contracts to manufacture this vaccine on their licenses that are going to maximize profits for them. They both expect billions of dollars in profit. Um, and the government certainly could make an arrangement that to pay them royalties, reasonable royalties, but also expand the availability of manufacturing so that we get doses out in the volume that we really need for a nation of 330 million people. I think that should be done. I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that these companies shouldn't profit, but it is certainly necessary to point out that that both of them, not just Moderna, benefited from federal investments in science. I mean, Moderna got an actual grant to develop its vaccine. Pfizer didn't get a development grant, but got a $2 billion contract from the federal government for distribution. But Pfizer, like Moderna, also benefited from federally funded research in messenger RNA vaccine technology, which they didn't need to invest in themselves because the government would make that investment in the basic technology. This has been an issue in many contexts. I think it's an issue with how Californians should exploit whatever gains we see from the stem cell program, which we've already invested $3 billion and we'll be investing another $5 billion over the next few years. When the public makes this sort of investment, the public has a right to get a benefit, a return, and we're not seeing that happen.
Thank you. To follow up on something that you said in your opening remarks about Medicare for all or single payer or the best way to extend Obamacare. So there is a question from Susan Goodlerner about the same issue in terms of what is your opinion for the best way to extend Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act?
Well, that question sort of goes to what parts of the Affordable Care Act, I mean, how we define the Affordable Care Act and how we get to the goal of universal coverage. Now, I mentioned in my remarks that I didn't think Medicare itself was necessarily the best model for universal health care for a couple of reasons. The major reason is that Medicare was not designed as a universal program. It was specifically designed as a program for seniors. And as a result, it's got a lot of gaps and it doesn't pay for a lot of services. All of that would have to be changed if we're going to use it to bring health coverage to people in their teens and 20s and 30s and 40s and really many in their 50s. There's no limit on out-of-pocket spending in Medicare. There are a lot of gaps, which is why people who are enrolled in Medicare either choose Medicare Advantage, which fills in some of those gaps, or buy Medigap policies. And that's because Medicare is not a be-all and end-all. But I don't think it's necessarily all that complicated. I think basically there are many models out in the world among developed countries for how you achieve universal coverage. And some basically make all healthcare a government program. Some have hybrid programs that combine government funding and government rules with the private provision of coverage. I think all of these are valid. Any of them could work in the United States. All we really need is the political will. One other thing that I would point out, because I've written about it recently, which is that there's an impression in public and even among well-educated executives that there's some secret sauce that has to be applied to bring the American healthcare system into line with the spending that we see elsewhere. The general idea, which is accurate, is that the U.S. spends about twice as much per capita on healthcare as other developed countries, or the average among other developed countries in Europe and Asia, and we don't get anywhere near their results. That's true, and but there is no secret sauce. There's no magic. Basically, we have this this outcome because we allow providers to charge prices that are higher than are charged anywhere else in the world. And as I pointed out when I wrote about the failure of this project by Amazon, by Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett and Jamie Dimon, to concoct some new program, which they have now just abandoned. America actually pays about as much as the rest of the world for hospital and medical care through its public programs, and that's Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, and the Child Health Insurance Program. Where things are out of whack is in our provision of private insurance, which pays much, much more than anybody else. That's the core of the problem, and we need to find a way to basically put a cap on that sort of spending, and that can be done, but once again, it's a question of political will. We need the public to understand this, and we need, with public understanding, we'll be in a situation where we can defeat the lobbying, the intense lobbying that we're going to see from the health insurance and hospital and medical society lobbyists.
Okay. There's a couple questions having to do with the Biden administration winning over the other side. But before I get to that, there's a question here from Tony Hale in terms of what do you think your role is, the media's role, the press role in challenging conspiracy-based right-wing propaganda, and what can the press do to reestablish a fact-based civil public dialogue? Also, what do you think about shutting down of social media accounts for people like the president spreading destructive conspiracy theories?
All right. Well, I think there are two questions, maybe three
Yes.
in there. First of all, I can only speak for myself. I do what I can to debunk conspiracy theories or basic lies whenever I can. I think that's part of the job, part of my job as I define it. And but I'm only one person. I think I was just reading today. Somewhere there's a report that says that the level of disinformation and misinformation on Twitter plummeted appreciably when Trump was shut down. Obviously, he was a major source. I think that when we talk about social media and their role in distributing misinformation, I think we need to be careful. And I wrote about this the day after Twitter shut down Trump's account. Not every operator on the internet is the same. You've got Twitter and Facebook and services, social media services like that at one level, but you also have services like your ISP, which maybe is your cable company or your phone company at another level. I think it's perfectly legitimate and in fact imperative for platforms like Facebook and Twitter to police their platforms. And I think the unfortunate thing is they've been more willing to do that for sort of fringe account holders than they have been for Trump. And they, I think it was understandable that Twitter, for example, would say, we know Trump is lying. We know that he's articulating these lies on our platform, but he is, after all, the president of the United States. And it's traditional. In fact, it's been traditional in the news industry to treat a president's words as something that we all need to hear, whether or not we believe them and whether or not he's faking us out or what have you. And this has been the tradition that goes back really to the dawn of newspapers, and I think to the dawn of the presidency, that the president is a unique individual, and the public really should have a way of hearing him. Now, the public doesn't have to hear him on Twitter, and it's perfectly legitimate for Twitter to say he's now crossed the line. But I think we also have to keep in mind that those of us who spend a lot of time on Twitter and maybe Facebook and other social media, we are, if we're in that group, we think these platforms are the be all and end all of information, whereas in fact, we are a minority. Most people still get their information from television and maybe newspapers and magazines and other printed material. I think if 10% of the American public spends a significant time per day on Twitter, that's a lot. I think the real percentage is much lower than that. It's just that for those of us who are in that sort of media world, we think that it's more important than it probably really is. Anyway, these are private companies. They have the right to monitor and police their own platforms. ISPs are a different story. We don't want them policing content because that's their role is really not to mediate content at all. It's just to make sure that information flows, that data flows from data sources to their subscribers. So I don't think we should regulate or force them to do any sort of moderating, but I think we should protect the right of the social media platforms to do whatever monitoring they think is necessary.
Okay, just to follow up, so there have been a couple questions in terms of how you think the Biden administration should engage the Trump supporters going forward, and that represent a hefty amount of the population. This is from Barbara Barr, and then there's another one from Michael Barb.
Well, I think it's an open question whether they do represent a hefty amount of the population. They represent a cohort that is loud. I am not at all convinced that they're anywhere near a majority or really representative of average Americans. I don't think Biden should go out of his way to engage the fringe because it's the fringe, and nothing he says or does is going to satisfy them or convince them. And I don't know that there's much that he needs to do to basically reach out to them. I think what's important is that when they commit crimes, they get prosecuted. I thought one of the most disappointing moments in the Obama administration was its failure to take action against the Bundys when they basically flouted law enforcement agencies, and they never paid a price. If they had paid a price, then I think we would have seen less of that. So, I mean, look, my email is published, my Twitter handle is published. I get, torrents of abusive and idiotic and basically misinformed and malinformed commentary all the time. When I get criticisms, sometimes I engage the critic if I think he or she is is looking for a serious conversation. And there are many who I continue to have exchanges with, sometimes fruitful and sometimes educational. And then there's, a sizable cadre who I just delete. There's no point in responding. There's no point in coming back to them or even acknowledging them.
I think your colleague, Steve Lopez, tried to acknowledge them in one of his columns, and it didn't go very well.
Well, Steve is, I think, not just once. I think Steve periodically tries to engage, and generally, he lets me know just as a colleague. And my advice to him, often he's engaging with somebody who has also written to me,
Oh,
and just we'll send the same email to me and Steve and Robin Abkarian and
oh,
maybe Sandy Banks and I just tell Steve, I just deleted this guy. There's no point in corresponding with him
right.
or her.
Okay. All right. On another topic, this has to do with the census data. This is from Walter, and he wants to know, Trump damaged the 2020 census. Do you think the Biden administration can rehabilitate the 2020 census data?
This is going to be an issue for Biden, something he's going to have to deal with. The courts, the specific effort by Trump to undermine the census count is over. It's been ruled illegal by the courts, and obviously it's not going to take place. But I think a lot of what Trump did is going to have a lasting effect, because it does discourage immigrants, even legal immigrants, from participating in public programs, including the census. I mean, the Trump attack, the so-called public charge attack, in which Trump threatened to use people's access to public programs like Medicare and Medicaid against them, drove a lot of this community or these communities underground. That wasn't good for public health. It wasn't good for society. It's going to have lasting effects. And I think Biden is going to have to take some specific steps to bring them out of the shadows. I think we've already seen that he intends to do that. The memo that we reported on this morning has a fair amount of material about immigration policies and providing a route to citizenship, even for undocumented immigrants.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go to a question that came in early. This came from Steve Goldsmith, and it has to do with you considering a deep dive into the backstory of how two refineries that use the deadly HF managed to use the building trade unions to flip the AQMD board, despite evidence by their own staff that a large release, which nearly happened here in the South Bay, poses a major threat to the lives and economy of environmental justice and beach communities of South Los Angeles County, especially relevant with our hospitals are over 100% capacity, expansion of the risk area by EPA to include Homeland Security facilities like LA Air Force Base and the two ports.
Well, this is actually a topic that I know nothing about. This is new to me. If Steve wants to send me an email about that, I'd be happy to take a look and see what I can do.
Okay, great. That's on you, Steve. Okay, this has to do with another one. You touched on it a little bit, but can the Biden administration, this is from Judy, can the Biden administration on its own raise the vehicle mileage requirements above the current California auto agreement? And would that supersede the California agreement, which compromised on early targets?
The Biden administration can set its own vehicle mileage requirements, if they're more stringent than California's, I think probably California would be happy to see that. But I think doing that is going to require a fair amount of technical work to create the technical foundations. This is something that obviously Trump didn't do, but the Obama administration did in great detail and with great professionalism. So Biden could do that. I think in practical terms, he probably will reinstate the Obama standards. And if you've been following this closely, you'll know that the contracts that California reached with Ford, Honda, VW, BMW of North America, and I can't remember the other automakers in its end run around the Trump attack, moderated the Obama level standards a bit, but really not much. And were not seen as any sort of significant rollback of the California standards. So California gave a little bit, but got agreements that were very important in the context of the Trump administration. So I think that's an area that Biden probably, I'd be surprised if he saw this as an area that he wants to tighten up even more.
Okay, since we have a past member of the AQMD on our in our audience, Judy Mitchell, I hear that she raised her hand. Did you want to respond to that, Judy? You can unmute yourself.
So, well, I can respond to that. I agree with Mr. Hiltzik on this, that we would want to return to the standards that were established under the Obama administration. And also we will want to have the California waiver reinstated. And I'm not sure whether Biden can do that by executive order or whether that has to go through another process. I think he may be able to do it by an executive order, simply reinstate our waiver.
Well, that's a good question. I know that when I looked into it, the repeal of the waiver and the creation of the new Trump standards occurred early enough in 2020 that they're out of reach of the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to overturn regulations that have been instituted, basically in practical terms, going back to August. I think the Trump actions were in March, but I think basically, I don't think Biden needs necessarily to go back to Congress to reinstate the California waiver or to go back to the Obama era level emission standards, in part because both of those actions are now in court, in federal court, and the attack on them from the state and from environmental agencies is that they were, those regulations were taken without adequate
Technical
administrative work. So they're vulnerable on basically as arbitrary and capricious, which is the term that judges use to overturn tons of Trump deregulatory actions.
Okay, on the same note, we have a question from David Hall. What is your assessment of the effectiveness of California's cap and trade approach to limiting greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, I've written about California's cap and trade many times, though I don't think I've visited the topic in the last 10 months to a year. The last time I looked at it, it was actually successful. But of course, it's been under attack by the refinery industry in particular, which has tried to undercut it, much to, I think, the industry's own disadvantage. I think it works well. It's an approach that I think has been proven in practice, not just here in California, but elsewhere. And it's basically a way to bring industries to meet standards, but to do it, within limits, at their own pace, and with their own and with technology that they find suitable. It doesn't really relieve them of the need to meet standards. It just gives them flexibility in how they do so. And I think it has worked. And it has produced in the past revenues that the state has been able to use. And maybe Judy has some thoughts on that as well.
I would want to say one thing, because people also have been promoting just a tax on greenhouse gas. But the reason that a cap and trade program works better, in my opinion, is because of the cap. In California, the cap requires the number of allocations and credits out there is reduced every year by 10%. So there's fewer credits out there for an industry to purchase. So they're required to reduce by 10% over time. And if you just tax greenhouse gases, that leaves industry just the power to pay to pollute. And I know people criticize cap and trade because it's pay to pollute, but it's pay to pollute with guaranteed reductions in greenhouse gases. And the state has met its requirements for greenhouse gas reduction under the program.
Thank you, Judy. I just want to also say, Michael, that Judy was invited to come on today, but in lieu of you being here, she let me interview her offline. So her interview will be in our February newsletter, but thank you, Judy. Okay, back to questions. And keeping with the California theme here, this came in from Jennifer, Michael. What do you think about the campaign to recall Governor Newsom, and how big a threat is it to his administration?
Those are good questions. I don't think much of the campaign. I think this is basically just a Republican stunt. It's obviously being financed in large part from outside the state. I don't know what its prospects of success are. I don't believe, unless something's happened very recently, that they have the signatures they need to put it on a ballot yet. I'm amazed, even in my neighborhood, to see a lot of lawn signs saying Happy New Year, but not to Gavin Newsom. I had great hopes for the Newsom administration. I thought in many ways he's more progressive even than Jerry Brown. I think obviously he's made a couple of significant blunders. The French Laundry is going to be hung around his neck for a long time. I don't know what he was thinking there. The vaccine rollout, he's going to take blame for, but I don't think it's necessarily deserved blame, because it's obviously a problem nationwide. I got out of the business of political prognostication on November 8th, 2016. So I'm wary of trying to predict what'll happen, especially in a case where, we've had a recall. This wouldn't be the first recall, obviously, but I think this is really just uncharted territory.
Yeah. There's another question. It's fairly long. This came from Mayron, I think is the name. Anyway, it has to do with Karl Rove, I guess, was on Fox News, and having to do with the dilemma of where the GOP is going, and should we or how should the Dems respond to the GOP quote civil war Should we watch from the sidelines, make an alliance with establishment GOP against the Trump faction? Your thoughts?
Well, I think it was Napoleon who said, you should never get in the way of an enemy making its own blunders. I think it's been clear for a couple of decades now that the Republican Party, as we know it, has become a regional, narrow-minded political party. It's been kept in power by essentially by gerrymandering in some states, by the peculiarities of the Electoral College, and by voter suppression, especially in the South. But I don't think we should mistake it for an equal participant in American governance. I believe, I'm not sure that a Republican has been legitimately elected president since before George W. Bush. But, we've had the Bush White House, and we've had the Trump White House. Trump obviously never won a majority of votes in the United States. His first election was a fluke. His defeat in November was not a fluke. So I think it's really up to the Republicans. I think we may be seeing the Republicans going the way of the Whigs, which made their own blunders and then went out of business. Certainly in California, we've seen them make blunders that have put them close to out of business. I mean, they may think they're resurging, but I'm not sure there's much evidence for that. They still don't have a single statewide office holder. And their blunder goes back to their attack on immigration with Prop 187, and they didn't pay the price immediately, but I think they're paying the price today. So I think basically the Republicans are going to have to figure out a way themselves to reach out to voters who disdain them today. Republicans have a big problem with younger voters. They obviously have a big problem with minority or majority minority communities in many states. They're going to have to figure out a way to remake themselves. But by the same token, I think the Democrats also, and I've written about this too, are going to have to be more serious about also reaching out to these communities, which is done more by lip service than by actual action in the past. I think Biden has indicated, I mean, still at this point, obviously it's rhetorical, but he's indicated his interest in doing that outreach. And I think there are many wise counsels in the Democratic Party who will have ideas as to how to do it, who to reach out to, and what policies really will cement a Democratic majority for the foreseeable future.
Good. There was a similar question from Marin about back in terms of the, we won in Georgia, but we lost in other places in the down ballot. So I think you just answered that. So there's also a question here from Connie in terms of how you think Trump's deregulation affected small business.
Can I ask the question?
Sure.
Yeah. So this is a really small bore question, but you're the person who will know the answer. So I'm really thrilled to ask you. And when I get in discussions with Trump supporters and they tell me how great he was for the economy, and I just kind of saw it as a continuation of the Obama economy, but he did stimulate with that tax cut. But they also tell me that he deregulated all sorts of things that help small businesses. And we're small business owners, and we're completely unaware of this great help we got from his deregulation. So I'm wondering if you can tell me what he did for us.
Well, I don't think he did anything for you, candidly. The question that I always raised when I wanted to address the issue of the Trump economy is always, whose economy are we talking about? He was great for stock investors. He was great for the oil and gas industry. But there's a limit to really what he can do in reality to help the oil and gas industry. It's going away. And what he did for them was to help them conduct a rearguard action. I think, Trump always claimed to do, he claimed to do a lot for manufacturers. He did nothing for manufacturers. He claimed to do a lot for small business. I don't see how he helped small businesses at all, really. Small businesses did not get a great benefit, or did not get as much of a benefit from the 2017 tax cut as big business did, and the proprietors of big businesses. So I think most of what Trump wants to claim as his economic victories is mythical. And we know, and I've written about this too, when we look at the long-term record, that Democratic leadership is always better for the economy and for business than Republican leadership. And that's because I think Republican policies tend to be narrowly focused, and they're not really based on creating a foundation for economic growth that's broad-based. And it's broad-based economic growth is what small businesses really need, not sort of scattershot, small bore deregulation.
So speaking of that, back in November, Prop 22 won. The gig economy was funded, by the gig economy, or by the Lyft, Uber, and folks. But now it's gone into the courts in terms of, is it constitutional? And what do you think of its chance to get overturned in the courts?
Well, I've been asking around a lot because I really thought Prop 22 was one of the worst initiatives we've ever seen. It's bad for workers. It's bad for gig workers. It's good only for the owners of Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Instacart, which funded this campaign 100%, $200 million. It was a record. It keeps being described as a record in California initiative spending. The truth is, it was a record nationally, because California always spent more on initiatives than any other state. And we broke every record here. I think the chances of overturning it, candidly, are slim. I keep asking the California Labor Federation what they're going to do about it, and they really don't have any good answers. The lawsuit that was filed basically takes the viewpoint or makes the assertion that the very high bar to amending it makes it unconstitutional. I wish them luck. I don't know that that's going to work. The only other option really to moderate the worst consequences of Prop 22 comes at the federal level. The National Labor Relations Board and the Department of Labor have the power to declare that gig workers are employees for the purpose of allowing them to organize, that is, to unionize. But they don't have the power to designate them as employees for wage and hour standards, which is an important part of Prop 22. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the NLRB and the Department of Labor under Biden take that position. It was a position that was being mooted under Obama, and then, of course, was stopped in its tracks under Trump. But of course, even if gig workers, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and what have you, get the right to organize, they then have to organize, which is always a challenge. And then even if they can certify union representation, they then have to sit down with these companies and negotiate a contract that basically gives them what Proposition 22 took away. The most interesting idea that I heard in the wake of Prop 22, I heard from Lorena Gonzalez, who was the author of AB 5, which was, of course, overturned by the Assemblywoman from San Diego. And she said, look, Proposition 22 bars us from regulating employment by the gig companies, but it doesn't bar us from regulating the gig companies. And if the state wants to be serious about bringing these companies to heel, it's got, a fair amount of power. It can condition their access to the airports, to their paying their drivers better, to basically meeting standards that Proposition 22 exempts them from. If I were king, if I were the chairman of the PUC, I would require that any ride-hailing service that wants to operate in the state of California has to establish a clear consumer response service, so that consumers who feel they've been cheated or or abused have a place to go and are required to get action. And I have to say, I speak in part from personal pique, because the last time I took an Uber ride, the driver dropped me off in the wrong place, tried to drop me off in the wrong place, flatly refused to take me to the destination, and then started screaming at me until I basically had to leave the car. And I complained to Uber. I got no response whatsoever. That driver is still on the road as far as I know, and she's dangerous. And I think that it's really up to the PUC and local officials to make sure that riders aren't cheated or harmed by the lax performance of the companies in dealing with bad drivers.
Just on another note, I thought I read where some of the grocery stores like Kroger are stopping there, where they had a delivery service, are letting go their employees and going with the gig economy.
Yeah,
so their employees were covered by the.
I wrote a column about this. Basically, it wasn't Kroger's, which owns Ralph's. It was Albertsons, which owns Vons and Pavilions down here, and Safeway in Northern California. Basically, Albertsons had a delivery service that had it for more than 10 years. And they basically are turning that over to DoorDash, which DoorDash is subject to Prop 22. Albertsons was not. Albertsons told me that they're going to try to find jobs for all of the delivery personnel who basically are going to lose their work, lose their employment. But we'll have to see. And I think this is the first of many such cases that we're going to see, where essentially companies start outsourcing work to gig companies that are covered by Prop 22.
Okay, getting back to a national note, what are your thoughts on the rats fleeing Trump's sinking ship, on the pardons that he's given, what you think might have been the worst, or what sticks up in your mind?
Well, I intend to keep an eye on all of them, and to I know that a number of sort of middle and low level employees of the Trump White House are complaining that they can't find work because no one will hire them. I think that's, I don't have any sympathy for them. I think it's a positive development. Some of you may have seen that Forbes sort of issued a broadside in which they said that any company that hires anybody like Sarah Sanders or Sean Spicer or any of the other paid liars who've been fronts for Trump should expect that no statement they issue will be treated as truth by Forbes. It'll be subject to a high level of scrutiny, and it should be. I think that any company, any law firm that welcomes back Trump administration officials should be exposed for doing it. I expect to do my part just to track this. I think these people, this administration was so far beyond the pale in terms of its cruelty and its flouting of government norms that anyone associated with really has a burden of proof that they deserve to be employed by anybody in the future.
Connie, you had your hand up? Okay, all right. I'm almost run out of questions. I was wondering if you wanted to we have just a few more minutes, if you have some closing remarks. It's been a pleasure having you. I think I don't know if you've seen some of the comments, but we're all a fan of your columns and are tickled that you're here. And I've learned a lot.
Well, I appreciate that. I have seen some of these comments, and I'm obviously grateful for all of the kind words. And I think just to sum up, we've had a lot of positive political developments in the last 2 months, really, and we should appreciate it and look forward to just returning to norms that have been trampled in the last 4 years. As I said at the outset, I expected things to be bad. I don't think I expected things to be anywhere near as bad as they got. But we now, we're going to have an administration that cares about governing, which we have not had for the last 4 years. We have an administration that cares about putting professionals in places of high responsibility. And I think we will begin to see the positive results very quickly. I look forward essentially to gaining access to a COVID vaccine in the near term. I would have not expected it to happen with any degree of competence under a Trump administration. It'll be very interesting to see how aggressively Biden moves to repair damage that otherwise will be lasting.
You're here. We all need that vaccine. All right. Thank you very much.
If we meet again a year from now, then, maybe the day will be brighter.
Yeah.